She points at the woman in the red dress and screams loud enough for the marble lobby to echo. "You're too ugly for my son." The words slice through the air harder than the finger inches from her face. Behind the glass revolving doors, a man in a black suit stops mid-step. The way he's staring at them through his sunglasses makes one question impossible to ignore. Who exactly did she just insult? Inside that quiet luxury lobby, every security camera suddenly matters. What nobody in that room knows is that the man who just walked in doesn't answer to the hotel, the police, or anyone bound by law. The woman being humiliated isn't reacting, not because she's weak, but because she's waiting. Her hands stay clasped. Her eyes stay down. That silence isn't submission. Her name is Shelley Cole, and moments ago she thought this was just a private family meeting. She thought walking away would end the insult. Instead, one sentence spoken in public triggered a chain reaction no one in that lobby could stop. What happened next exposed a truth powerful enough to destroy a dynasty. But before I show you what happened after that man walked through those doors, you need to understand why this insult mattered. Because this confrontation didn't start in that lobby. It started 6 months earlier, when Shelley agreed to meet a man she'd never seen, about a family she was never supposed to be part of. And the woman screaming at her had no idea who she was really talking to. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 5,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter and tell her where you are watching from. 6 months earlier, Shelley Cole almost ignored a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Shelley had spent the last 2 years keeping her professional life small on purpose. She worked from a modest office in Brooklyn, took on select clients, and never advertised her full credentials. Most people who met her assumed she was just another consultant trying to build a portfolio. She let them think that. The voice on the other end was polite, professional. A man named David Park wanted to discuss a family matter. He'd been given her name by someone he wouldn't identify over the phone. Could they meet somewhere private? Shelley said yes, but only after she ran his name through 3 separate databases. David Park checked out. Son of a prominent Korean-American family, clean background, no red flags. What the search didn't tell her was who actually arranged the meeting. Now, Shelley thought she was being contacted for standard estate planning. Something discreet for a family that valued privacy. But here's what she didn't discover until weeks later. David Park had never heard of her before that phone call. Someone else picked her name. Someone else set the meeting. Someone else had been watching her financial work for months, tracking which cases she took and which ones she walked away from. And the person who made that call had a file on Shelley that went back further than 6 months. It went back to her childhood. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in early March, Shelley had no idea she was being tested. The meeting took place at a restaurant in Midtown. Neutral ground. David arrived alone, which surprised her. He was younger than she expected. Early 30s, well-dressed, the kind of person who looked comfortable in expensive spaces. He ordered tea. She ordered coffee. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. But Shelley noticed something. Every time she asked about the family matter David had mentioned on the phone, he checked his watch, like he was waiting for permission to answer. Then he said something that made her pause. "My family doesn't usually work with outsiders." Shelley nodded. She'd heard that before from families who built their wealth quietly. "But we need someone who understands discretion," David continued. "Someone who won't ask the wrong questions." That's when Shelley should have walked away. That phrasing, "wrong questions," was a signal she'd learned to recognize. It meant the client wanted someone complicit, not competent. But David softened it immediately. He talked about his mother's concerns, about family legacy, about wanting to make sure certain agreements were handled properly. He made it sound reasonable. And Shelley, despite every instinct she'd honed over years of private consulting, agreed to a second meeting. What David didn't mention, what Shelley wouldn't piece together until much later, was that she'd already passed the first test just by showing up. Because Shelley Cole wasn't poor. She wasn't desperate for clients. Her reduced professional profile was deliberate. She had family money she never disclosed, connections she never leveraged, and a background that would have impressed the Parks if they'd known about it. But she'd hidden all of that. She drove a modest car, rented a small office, dressed well but never extravagantly. And someone in the Park family had noticed that restraint. They wanted someone who knew how to be invisible when it mattered. But Shelley didn't realize she was being evaluated. At the time, she thought she was simply doing her job. The second meeting happened 3 weeks later. Same restaurant. This time, David brought paperwork. Legal documents that needed review. Estate structures that looked standard on the surface but had unusual clauses buried in the fine print. Shelley read through everything carefully. She asked questions. David answered some and deflected others. Then he said something that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. "Would you be willing to meet my family?" Shelley hesitated. Meeting the family meant this was more than a consulting job. It meant getting pulled into their world in ways she couldn't control. But David's tone wasn't pushy. He seemed almost reluctant himself, like he was following instructions he didn't fully agree with. "Just my mother," he clarified. "She wants to meet you before we move forward." Shelley agreed. She told herself it was professional courtesy. One meeting, then she'd decide whether to continue. What she didn't know was that David Park had no say in whether she'd be invited to that meeting. The invitation didn't come from David. It came from someone David himself had never met in person. Someone who operated in the background of his family's financial structure. Someone his mother answered to but never spoke about openly. Frank Minho had arranged the entire sequence of events. He'd selected Shelley's name from a list of consultants. He'd instructed David on what to say and when to say it. He'd even chosen the restaurant because it was close to a building he already had under surveillance. David thought he was protecting his family's privacy. He had no idea he was following a script written by a man who'd been managing his family's real assets for over a decade. And Shelley, careful, controlled Shelley, was about to walk into a meeting that had nothing to do with estate planning and everything to do with a test she didn't know she was taking. When she arrived at the Park family's penthouse the following week, ready to discuss legal structures and financial planning, she had no idea that the woman waiting for her had already decided she wasn't good enough. And she definitely didn't know that the man watching from the security feed had already decided the opposite. What Shelley would discover 3 weeks later would make her question every word spoken in that penthouse. Because the apartment she was sitting in, it didn't belong to the Parks at all. The penthouse meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in late April. Shelley arrived 15 minutes early, which was her habit. The building had the kind of lobby where doormen remembered faces and security cameras tracked every angle. She signed in at the desk, took the elevator to the 42nd floor, and knocked on the door marked 42C. Evelyn Park opened it herself. No assistant, no staff, just a woman in her mid-50s wearing a black Chanel suit and an expression that said she'd already made up her mind about something. "Miss Cole," Evelyn said. Not a question, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement that Shelley had arrived. The apartment had the kind of furniture you didn't sit on unless invited, white Italian leather that showed every fingerprint. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Central Park looked like a postage stamp 42 floors below. Evelyn gestured toward a chair in the living room. Shelley sat. David wasn't there, which felt significant, but Shelley couldn't explain why. "My son tells me you're discreet," Evelyn began. "I am. Good. Because what we discuss stays between us." Shelley nodded. Standard confidentiality. She'd signed agreements like this before. But what Evelyn said next wasn't standard at all. "We're considering a marriage arrangement," Evelyn stated flatly. "For David. It needs to be handled carefully." Shelley kept her expression neutral, but inside, alarm bells started ringing. Marriage arrangement. Not a business merger. Not estate planning. An actual arranged marriage. "I see," Shelley said carefully. "And you need legal consultation for the financial structures involved?" "Among other things." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "David mentioned you, but I need to make sure you understand what kind of family you'd be working with." That phrasing, "working with," felt deliberately vague. Shelley had been in enough high-stakes negotiations to know when someone was testing her. So she asked the question most consultants wouldn't. "What kind of family are you, Mrs. Park?" Evelyn smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "The kind that values loyalty over credentials." Now, Shelley thought she was being warned about family politics. Rich families had complicated dynamics. She'd navigated that before. But here's what she didn't discover until 2 months later, after she'd already agreed to continue working with the Parks. Evelyn wasn't describing her own family's values. She was quoting someone else. Someone who'd given Evelyn very specific instructions about what to say in that meeting. And the family name Evelyn used, Park, wasn't the name that actually controlled their assets. That name was buried in offshore accounts and private holding companies, and it belonged to a network Shelley had only read about in financial crime reports. A network that didn't forgive mistakes and didn't forget debts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in that penthouse in April, Shelley had no idea she was sitting in an apartment that technically belonged to someone Evelyn had never met face to face. 20 minutes later, Shelley had answered every question Evelyn asked. But Evelyn hadn't answered a single one of hers. Evelyn asked questions that seemed routine. Shelley's experience with international contracts, her familiarity with estate law, whether she'd ever worked with Korean families before. Shelley answered honestly. She had experience. She understood cultural nuances. She could handle complexity. What Shelley didn't mention was that she'd recognized something the moment Evelyn opened the door. A detail so small most people would have missed it. On the entry table, partially visible under a stack of mail, was a business card. The logo wasn't one Shelley had seen before, but the design, a specific geometric pattern used by certain financial networks in Seoul, was something she'd come across once in graduate school. In a case study about organized financial structures that operated outside traditional banking systems. Shelley's stomach dropped the second she processed what that logo meant. The Park family wasn't just wealthy. They were connected to something much larger. The family name she'd been given, Park, was common enough to seem innocent. But that logo connected them to the Jopik networks, the Korean organized crime families that had transitioned from street-level operations into sophisticated financial empires over the past 3 decades. These weren't gangs. They were corporate entities with legal fronts and illegal foundations. And if the Parks were working with that network, then everything about this meeting was more dangerous than Shelley had calculated. But Shelley didn't say anything. She kept her face calm, finished the meeting, shook Evelyn's hand, and walked out of that apartment knowing she should never go back. The second time she walked into that penthouse, Shelley brought a weapon Evelyn would never see coming. It arrived at her office on a Monday morning. No return address. Inside was a single document, a background check. On her, complete and thorough. It included details about her family that she'd never disclosed publicly. Her grandmother's estate, her father's investments, even her college thesis topic. And at the bottom of the last page, handwritten in pen, was a single sentence. "We already know who you are." That's when Shelley understood. This wasn't a job offer. It was a recruitment. And whoever was behind it had been watching her long before David Park made that first phone call. What Shelley couldn't have known, what she wouldn't discover until the lobby incident, was that every conversation she'd had with the Parks had been monitored. Not by Evelyn, not by David, by Frank Minho's security team. They'd recorded the penthouse meeting. They'd photographed her entering and leaving the building. They'd tracked her phone, her emails, her movements. And when Evelyn Park made the decision to humiliate Shelley in that hotel lobby, Frank's team was already positioned. They had cameras in the lobby, audio surveillance in the elevators, security personnel disguised as hotel staff. Because Frank Minho didn't leave anything to chance. And if Evelyn was going to test whether Shelley could stay silent under pressure, Frank wanted proof of exactly what happened. Proof he could use later when Evelyn's judgment needed to be corrected. While Shelley was enduring that public insult, believing she was protecting a private agreement, people loyal to the man in black were documenting every word, every gesture, every second of restraint. And the footage they captured would become the evidence that destroyed Evelyn Park's credibility and confirmed Shelley's position in a power structure she still didn't fully understand. But that confrontation was still weeks away. Back in May, after receiving that background check, Shelley made a choice. She could walk away and hope they'd leave her alone. Or she could stay and find out what they actually wanted. She chose to stay. And when she showed up for the next meeting with Evelyn Park, she brought something with her that signaled she understood the game. A folder containing research on Korean financial networks, including a section on the Jopic transition from criminal operations to legitimate business empires. She placed it on the coffee table without saying a word. Evelyn looked at it, then looked at Shelley. And for the first time since they'd met, Evelyn's expression shifted. Not to respect, but to recognition. Shelley wasn't naive. She'd done her homework, and that changed everything about how the Parks would treat her going forward. At least Evelyn thought it did. What Evelyn didn't realize was that the folder wasn't Shelley's idea. It had been suggested to her in an anonymous email 3 days earlier, an email sent from an encrypted address that would eventually be traced back to Frank Minho's personal assistant. Every move Shelley made was being guided. Every test was orchestrated. And the woman who thought she was protecting her family's interests was actually following a script written by the man who held the real power. The man who was about to walk through a glass door and change everything. The email that changed everything arrived on a Wednesday in mid-June. No subject line, just a time, a date, and an address, a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Shelley stared at it for 10 minutes before responding. The sender was listed as FM. She didn't need to guess who that was. She'd spent the last month researching the name Frank Minho. Not much came up in public records. A few corporate registrations. Some real estate holdings under shell companies. But people who worked in international finance knew the name. And they didn't say it casually. Shelley replied with one word, confirmed. 3 days later, she walked into the lobby of the hotel where, 2 months after this meeting, Evelyn Park would publicly humiliate her. But on that June afternoon, the lobby was quiet. No confrontation, no screaming, just Shelley, a reception desk, and an elevator that took her to the 14th floor. Room 1407. She knocked twice. The door opened immediately. Frank Minho stood in the doorway wearing a black suit and no expression. He was shorter than she expected, maybe 5'9", but the way he stood made height irrelevant. He gestured for her to come inside without saying a word. The room wasn't a standard hotel room, it was a suite, converted into what looked like a temporary office. Laptop on the desk. Papers organized in neat stacks. A sealed folder placed deliberately in the center of the coffee table. "Miss Cole," Frank said. His English was perfect. No accent. "Thank you for coming." Shelley sat in the chair he indicated. "You asked to meet. I'm here. I wanted to see you in person." Frank sat across from her, hands folded. "To determine if you're the right choice." "For what?" "For something the Parks don't understand yet. That sentence hung in the air. Shelley kept her face neutral, but her pulse quickened. This wasn't about consulting. This was about something else entirely. Frank continued. Evelyn Park believes she's hiring you to manage her son's marriage arrangement. She thinks she controls who David marries and how their assets are structured. But Evelyn doesn't control anything. I do. Shelley should have stood up and walked out. Every instinct she'd developed over years of private work told her this conversation was dangerous. But she stayed seated. Because Frank had just confirmed what she'd suspected since seeing that logo in Evelyn's penthouse. The Parks were fronts. Someone else held the real authority. Why are you telling me this? Shelley asked. Because you need to understand what you're walking into, Frank replied. The Parks owe me. Their wealth, their status, their reputation, all of it exists because I allow it. And now I need something from them that they don't want to give. What's that? Legitimacy. Frank leaned forward slightly. My organization has spent 30 years building financial structures that operate outside traditional oversight. We're effective, but we're not legitimate. Not in the eyes of the families who control old money and social access. The Parks have that legitimacy. They have the connections, the reputation, the acceptance. I need to merge those worlds. And you're going to help me do it. Now, Shelley thought Frank was recruiting her for some kind of financial restructuring. A way to legitimize criminal assets through legal channels. She'd heard of these arrangements before. Consultants brought in to create corporate structures that made dirty money look clean. But here's what she didn't discover until after the lobby incident, when Frank finally explained the full plan. He wasn't trying to legitimize his money. He was trying to legitimize his daughter. The marriage arrangement wasn't for David Park to marry some carefully selected bride from an appropriate family. It was for David to marry Frank's daughter, a woman who'd been raised in Seoul, educated in Switzerland, and kept completely separate from her father's criminal network. Frank wanted his daughter to have the life he never could. A life with social acceptance, legal protection, and a family name that didn't trigger background checks. And Shelley wasn't being hired to structure the deal. She was being positioned as a decoy. Someone the Parks would focus on and underestimate while Frank's real plan moved forward in the background. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in that hotel room in June, Shelley had no idea she was being used as misdirection. I don't work for criminal organizations, Shelley said carefully. Frank smiled. It was the first time she'd seen any emotion on his face. You think I'm offering you a job? I'm not. I'm telling you what's already happening. You accepted David's invitation. You met with Evelyn. You showed them your research. You're already involved. The only question now is whether you understand your role. And what role is that? The role of someone who knows when to be visible and when to disappear. Someone who can take an insult without reacting. Someone who understands that real power doesn't announce itself. It waits. That's when Shelley understood. Frank wasn't recruiting her. He was testing her. And the test wouldn't happen in this room. It would happen later, in public, when someone tried to humiliate her and she had to choose between defending herself and staying silent. What happens if I refuse? Shelley asked. You won't refuse, Frank said, because you're curious. You want to see how this ends. And you're smart enough to know that people who walk away from me don't get very far. That wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Shelley had done enough research to know that Frank Minho's organization didn't make dramatic gestures. They didn't send warnings or make examples. They simply removed obstacles quietly and moved forward. If Shelley refused, she wouldn't be harmed. She'd just find that her consulting business suddenly lost clients. Her banking relationships became complicated, and doors that were once open would quietly close. What Shelley didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Frank Minho's meeting with her wasn't his first visit to that hotel. He'd been tracking the Park family for 8 months before he ever made contact with Shelley. He had people inside their accounting firm, He had access to their legal documents. He knew about David's gambling debts, Evelyn's offshore accounts, and the fact that the Park family fortune was almost gone. They were living on credit and reputation, desperately trying to maintain an image of wealth while their actual assets disappeared. Frank had orchestrated their financial collapse deliberately. He'd bought their debts, called in loans, and created pressure that forced them to accept his terms. And when Evelyn thought she was arranging a strategic marriage for her son, she was actually agreeing to a merger that would put her family under Frank's complete control. The hotel lobby confrontation, the public humiliation that would happen 2 months later, wasn't random. Frank had chosen that location specifically. He knew Evelyn would be there. He knew she'd react badly to seeing Shelley. And he knew that her reaction would give him the evidence he needed to prove she was unfit to represent his daughter's interests. The entire sequence was planned, and Shelley was the key piece. But Shelley didn't realize that yet. At the time, she was focused on surviving the conversation. Frank stood up, signaling the meeting was over. He walked to the coffee table and picked up the sealed folder. This contains information about you, your family, your assets, things you've never told the Parks. If you agree to continue working with them, this folder stays sealed. If you try to expose what I've told you today, this folder becomes public. And the Parks will learn that you're not the modest consultant you've been pretending to be. Shelley's hands clenched. That's blackmail. That's insurance, Frank corrected. You stay quiet. You play your role. And when this is finished, you'll be compensated in ways that go beyond money. You'll have my protection, my network, my respect. Those things are worth more than anything the Parks could offer you. He handed her a card. Plain white. Just a phone number printed in black ink. If you ever need to reach me, use this. Don't save the number. Memorize it. Shelley took the card. She memorized the number in under 30 seconds. Then she stood up, nodded once, and walked toward the door. Miss Cole, Frank said as she reached for the handle. She turned back. When Evelyn insults you, and she will, don't defend yourself. Let her finish. Let everyone see who she really is. That moment will determine everything. Shelley left the hotel that afternoon carrying a truth she couldn't share with anyone. Her silence wasn't going to be a professional choice. It was a requirement. Frank had made it clear that if she spoke publicly, if she defended herself when Evelyn attacked, if she revealed the connections she'd discovered, if she tried to warn the Parks about what was really happening, the consequences wouldn't just affect her. They'd affect her family. Frank's folder contained information about her father's investments, her mother's medical history, her younger brother's scholarship funding. He'd done his research, and his message was simple. Stay quiet and stay safe. The restraint Shelley would show in that lobby 2 months later, the dignity that would seem so powerful, wasn't just about self-control. It was about protection. She'd been told explicitly never to reveal the truth publicly. And she'd agreed because the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of silence. But what Frank didn't tell her, what she wouldn't understand until much later, was that her silence was also a gift. By not defending herself, by letting Evelyn's cruelty play out without interruption, Shelley would create the exact conditions Frank needed. Public witnesses, clear documentation, undeniable evidence that Evelyn Park was not the dignified matriarch she pretended to be. And when Frank finally revealed Shelley's true identity and value, the contrast would be devastating. Evelyn's power would collapse, and Shelley's position would become untouchable. Shelley walked out of that hotel believing she was trapped. What she didn't realize was that Frank had just given her the blueprint for her own transformation. She just had to trust him long enough to see it happen. 2 months later, she'd find out if that trust was justified. When Evelyn Park pointed her finger and screamed in a marble lobby, Shelley would remember Frank's words. Let her finish. Let everyone see who she really is. And behind the glass doors, Frank Minho would be watching, waiting for the exact moment to walk in and change everything. The day of the lobby confrontation started with a phone call. Evelyn Park's voice was tight when she spoke. "We need to meet today. The hotel downtown. 2 o'clock. Shelley checked her calendar. She had nothing scheduled. "What's this about?" "David wants to finalize some decisions. About the arrangement." The word arrangement felt loaded. Shelley had been working with the Parks for 2 months since her meeting with Frank, and the marriage plan still hadn't been explained clearly. Every time she asked direct questions, Evelyn changed the subject. David stayed vague. And Frank hadn't contacted her once since that day in June. "I'll be there," Shelley said. She hung up and stared at her phone for a long moment. Something felt wrong. The timing was too sudden. The location was too public. But she'd agreed to play her role, so she got dressed, put on the red dress she'd bought specifically for formal meetings, and headed downtown. When she arrived at the hotel, the lobby was nearly empty. A few guests checking in. Security personnel near the doors. Evelyn was already there, standing near the elevators with her arms crossed. David stood beside her looking uncomfortable. He wouldn't meet Shelley's eyes. "Miss Cole," Evelyn said coldly. "Mrs. Park." Shelley kept her voice neutral. "I wanted to speak with you before we proceed with any further arrangements." Evelyn's tone was clipped, professional, but there was something underneath it. Anger, maybe fear. "I've been doing some research. About you." Shelley's stomach tightened. "What kind of research?" "The kind that tells me you're not who you've been pretending to be." That sentence hung in the air. Shelley stayed silent. This was the moment Frank had warned her about. Don't defend yourself. Let her finish. "You've been presenting yourself as some modest consultant," Evelyn continued, her voice rising slightly. "But you come from money, don't you? Your family has assets, connections. You've been hiding that from us deliberately." Shelley didn't respond. She could feel other people in the lobby starting to notice the conversation. A woman at the front desk glanced over. Security shifted position near the doors. "I don't appreciate being deceived," Evelyn said. Her voice was louder now, enough that people were definitely listening. "And I certainly don't appreciate my son being manipulated by someone who's been lying from the beginning." "Mother," David said quietly, "maybe we should do this somewhere private." "No." Evelyn turned fully toward Shelley, and that's when her composure cracked completely. Her hand came up, her finger pointed, and she screamed the words that would change everything. "You're too ugly for my son." The lobby went silent. Shelley stood perfectly still, her hands clasped, her eyes down. Every instinct told her to respond, to defend herself, to walk away. But Frank's voice echoed in her mind. Let her finish. Let everyone see who she really is. Now, Shelley thought Evelyn's outburst was personal. A mother protecting her son from someone she considered unworthy. But here's what Shelley didn't discover until Frank explained it weeks later. Evelyn had just received a letter that morning. A formal notice from Frank's legal team informing her that the marriage arrangement she thought she was controlling had already been finalized. Without her input, the bride wasn't someone Evelyn had chosen. It was Frank's daughter. And the contract Evelyn had signed months earlier, thinking it was a standard financial agreement, actually gave Frank legal authority over David's marriage decisions. Evelyn had signed away her control without realizing it. And when she tried to call Frank to protest, his assistant told her he was unavailable. So Evelyn did the only thing she could think of. She lashed out at Shelley, the one person in this arrangement she thought she could still intimidate. But that decision, made in panic and rage, was exactly what Frank had been waiting for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in that lobby, Shelley had no idea that Evelyn's attack was rooted in desperation rather than arrogance. You think you can walk into our family and take what you want? Evelyn's voice was shaking now. You think your little consulting business and your fake modesty make you acceptable? You're nothing. You have nothing. And you will never be part of this family. David put his hand on his mother's arm. That's enough. Don't touch me, Evelyn snapped. She was spiraling now, unable to stop. I will not let my son marry someone like her. I don't care what anyone says. This ends today. That's when Shelley saw movement through the glass revolving doors. A man in a black suit, sunglasses, walking toward the entrance with purpose. Frank Minho had arrived. What Evelyn didn't know, what she would only discover in the worst possible way, was that every asset she thought belonged to her family was actually controlled by Frank. The penthouse she lived in, owned by one of Frank's shell companies. The investment accounts in her name, co-signed by Frank's financial managers. Even the jewelry she wore, the pieces she'd inherited from her mother, had been used as collateral for loans that Frank now held. Evelyn Park's entire existence was built on money and property that Frank Minho controlled. She'd been living on borrowed wealth for years, convinced it was hers, never realizing that Frank could take it all away with a single legal filing. Her status, her reputation, her ability to attend charity galas and sit on nonprofit boards, all of it depended on Frank's continued allowance. And the moment she screamed at Shelley in that public lobby, calling her ugly and unworthy, Evelyn unknowingly attacked the woman Frank had positioned as untouchable. The woman who represented his daughter's interests. The woman who carried documentation proving the Parks owed Frank everything. But Evelyn didn't realize that yet. At the time, she was focused on asserting control she no longer possessed. Frank pushed through the revolving doors and stopped. He didn't walk toward them immediately. He just stood there, 10 feet away, watching. His face showed nothing. But the way he positioned himself made everyone in that lobby aware of his presence. Security noticed him. The front desk staff noticed him. Even David, who'd been focused on his mother, turned his head and froze. Evelyn saw Frank and her expression changed instantly. The rage drained from her face. What replaced it was something Shelley had never seen before. Pure fear. Mr. Minho, Evelyn said. Her voice was different now. Smaller. I didn't know you'd be here. Frank didn't respond. He just looked at her. Then at Shelley. Then back at Evelyn. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Mother, David said quietly. Who is that? And that's when Shelley understood something that made her blood run cold. David didn't know. He'd never met Frank. He didn't know who actually controlled his family's finances. He didn't know about the loans, the contracts, the agreements his mother had signed. He thought he was an independent adult making decisions about his own life. He had no idea he was a piece in someone else's plan. The truth David was about to learn, the truth that would shatter everything he believed about his family, was that he'd never had any authority over the marriage arrangement. Not from the beginning. His mother had told him he was meeting potential brides, evaluating options, making choices. But every woman he'd met had been pre-selected by Frank. Every decision had already been made. And the marriage contract he thought he'd be signing in a few months had actually been finalized weeks ago. Frank's lawyers had filed the paperwork. The bride was chosen. And David's signature wasn't required because his mother had signed power of attorney documents years earlier, giving Frank's organization legal control over major family decisions during times of financial distress. Evelyn thought those documents were temporary, emergency measures during a brief cash flow problem. She didn't realize Frank had never released that authority. He'd been making decisions for the Park family for over 3 years. And David, proud, oblivious David, was about to discover that he'd never been in control of his own life. But that realization was still seconds away. First, David turned to his mother with a question that would change everything. Mother, who is that man? Evelyn's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Frank finally moved. He walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall echoed on the marble floor. When he reached them, he stopped directly in front of Evelyn. He was shorter than her, but she looked like she wanted to disappear. "Mrs. Park," Frank said quietly, "we need to talk. Privately." "Yes," Evelyn whispered. "Of course." Frank turned to Shelley. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he did something Shelley wasn't expecting. He nodded. Once. A gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. And in that single movement, everyone watching understood something had shifted. Frank looked at David. "Come with us." "I don't," David started. "Come with us," Frank repeated. Not louder, but absolute. David followed. They walked toward the elevators. Evelyn moved like someone walking to an execution. David moved like someone finally understanding they'd been lied to their entire life. And Shelley stayed exactly where she was, standing in the middle of that lobby, still silent, still composed, while every person who'd witnessed Evelyn's attack now watched the woman who'd screamed fall apart and follow a man who'd said almost nothing. The elevator doors closed. Shelley finally let out a breath. Her hands were shaking, but no one could see because she kept them clasped. She'd done exactly what Frank asked. She'd stayed silent. She'd let Evelyn finish. She'd endured the humiliation without defending herself. And now, somewhere upstairs, Frank was about to reveal truths that would destroy the Park family's reputation and change Shelley's position forever. She just had to wait for him to finish. The elevator doors closed on Evelyn's terrified face. Shelley remained in the lobby, exactly where Frank had told her to stay. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them together harder, maintaining the composure that had kept her silent through Evelyn's attack. The front desk clerk wouldn't meet her eyes. Security had shifted position near the windows. Even the guests waiting by the elevators had gone quiet. Shelley walked toward the seating area near the far wall and sat down. She didn't leave. She didn't cry. She waited, because Frank had given her one final instruction during their June meeting, something she'd almost forgotten until this moment. After it happens, stay visible. Let them see you didn't run. Now, Shelley thought she was waiting for Frank to come back downstairs and tell her what happened in that meeting. She thought her role was finished. She'd played her part, endured the insult, demonstrated the restraint Frank demanded. But here's what she didn't discover until Frank explained it 3 days later. Her waiting in that lobby wasn't just about composure. It was evidence. Frank's security team was still recording. Hotel staff were still watching. And every minute Shelley remained in that space, calm and present while Evelyn Park hid upstairs, created a visual narrative that would be impossible to dispute. The woman who'd been called ugly and unworthy was sitting in public view, dignified and undisturbed. The woman who'd screamed those words was nowhere to be seen. That contrast would matter when Frank made his final move. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in that lobby, Shelley had no idea she was still being documented. 40 minutes passed. Shelley didn't move. She watched people come and go through the revolving doors. She noticed the security guard near the entrance checking his phone twice, then speaking quietly into his radio. She saw the front desk clerk take a call, glance toward the elevators, then hang up without saying a word. Then the elevator chimed. The doors opened. Frank stepped out first. Alone. He walked directly to where Shelley sat. He didn't sit down. He stood in front of her, removed his sunglasses, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he did something that made everyone in that lobby stop what they were doing. He bowed. A full, formal bow. The kind reserved for someone of significant status. When Frank straightened, he extended his hand. Shelley stood slowly and shook it. His grip was firm but brief. "Miss Cole," Frank said clearly, his voice carrying across the marble floor. I apologize for what you were subjected to today. It was inappropriate. It will not happen again. The lobby felt like it had stopped breathing. The Parks have been informed of their position, Frank continued, and yours. There will be a formal correction issued by the end of the week. Your reputation will not suffer from this incident. Shelley opened her mouth to respond, but Frank held up one hand gently. You handled yourself with extraordinary dignity, he said, exactly as I knew you would. That's when Frank revealed something that changed everything Shelley thought she understood about the last 6 months. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the sealed folder, the one he'd shown her in June, the one containing information about her family and background. He held it but didn't open it. Mrs. Park believed she was interviewing you for a consulting position, Frank said. She thought she was evaluating whether you were suitable to manage her son's marriage arrangement. But that was never the actual purpose of these meetings. Shelley's stomach tightened. What was the purpose? To determine if you could represent my daughter's interests without compromising under pressure. Frank's expression didn't change. The marriage arrangement Mrs. Park thought she controlled was finalized 8 weeks ago. My daughter will marry David Park in 6 months. And you, Miss Cole, will serve as her legal representative and financial advisor. The words hit Shelley like ice water. Frank's daughter. The marriage arrangement had never been about finding David a bride. It was about positioning Frank's daughter into a family that had legitimacy, social standing, and a name that wouldn't trigger immediate background checks. Your background, Frank continued, gesturing with the folder. Your discretion, your ability to operate below your actual capabilities. Those qualities made you valuable. But what made you irreplaceable was what just happened in this lobby. Mrs. Park attacked you publicly. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't reveal what you knew. You maintained silence even when you had every right to speak. Frank finally opened the folder. Inside were documents Shelley had never seen. Legal papers, financial disclosures, and photographs of a young woman who looked nothing like Frank but had his eyes. Her name is Mincio, Frank said quietly. She's 26. She was educated in Switzerland. She speaks 4 languages. And she knows nothing about my business operations. I built my organization so she wouldn't have to, but I cannot give her the one thing she wants most. Acceptance in circles that will never acknowledge my name. Frank closed the folder and handed it to Shelley. You come from a family those circles already accept. You have credentials they respect. And after today, you have something even more valuable. Proof that you can endure their worst attacks without breaking. Shelley took the folder with hands that no longer shook. She understood now. The entire 6 months had been an audition. Every meeting, every conversation, every moment she'd chosen discretion over disclosure. And the final test, the public humiliation, had been designed to prove she could protect Mincio when social cruelty came, as Frank knew it would. Where are Evelyn and David? Shelley asked. Upstairs, Frank said, being informed of reality. What Shelley didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until she read the legal documents Frank had just given her, was that Evelyn Park's world had already collapsed before Frank walked into that lobby. The penthouse she lived in wasn't hers. The investment accounts bearing her name were controlled by trusts Frank managed. Even the jewelry she wore daily had been purchased with loans Frank held. Every asset, every account, every piece of property the Park family believed they owned was actually leverage Frank had been holding for 3 years. Evelyn had signed documents during a financial emergency, thinking they were temporary. Frank had never released them. And the moment Evelyn screamed at Shelley in public, attacking the woman Frank had positioned to represent his daughter, she violated the one clause in those agreements that mattered. She acted against Frank's designated representatives without authorization. Upstairs, in a hotel conference room, Frank's lawyers were presenting Evelyn with a choice. transfer full control of David's legal and financial decisions to Frank's organization, or face immediate foreclosure on every property, every account, every asset. She could maintain her lifestyle and public image by cooperating. Or she could fight and lose everything within 72 hours. The park's social standing depended entirely on perceived wealth. Without it, the invitations would stop. The charity boards would quietly remove her name. The friends would disappear. Evelyn was being given the chance to preserve appearances, but only if she accepted that Frank, not her, controlled her family's future. And David was learning something even worse. Every decision he thought he'd made independently over the last 5 years, his business ventures, his property purchases, even his choice of friends, had been influenced by people Frank had positioned around him. The gambling debts David thought he'd paid off privately, Frank had bought them. The investment opportunity that seemed too good to refuse, Frank had arranged it. David Park had been managed like an asset, groomed like a resource, and delivered into a marriage he'd never actually chosen. And the woman he was about to marry, Mincio, would be the only honest thing in his life going forward. But Shelley didn't know those details yet. At the time, standing in that lobby with Frank's folder in her hands, she was focused on one simple truth. She'd survived. The insult hadn't destroyed her. The silence hadn't weakened her. And the man who held real power had just acknowledged her publicly, in front of witnesses who would never forget what they saw. Frank put his sunglasses back on. The car outside will take you home. Read the documents. Meet Mincio next Tuesday. She's expecting you. What happens to Evelyn? Shelley asked. She learns to be quiet, Frank said. Or she learns what happens when people aren't. He turned and walked back toward the elevators. Shelley watched him go. Then she looked down at the folder in her hands. Inside was a future she hadn't planned for, a role she hadn't auditioned for, and a truth she just discovered. Real power doesn't announce itself. It waits for arrogance to expose its own weakness. Then it simply walks through the door and changes everything. Shelley left the hotel that afternoon carrying more than documents. She carried proof that silence, chosen strategically, could be louder than any defense. And the woman who'd called her ugly would spend the rest of her life knowing she'd insulted the one person she couldn't afford to offend. The woman the Korean Mafia boss had chosen to protect his daughter. If you stayed until the end, you already understand what this story was really about. If stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe and stay with us. There are more truths like this waiting to be revealed.